Welcome to Mindful. My name is Dr. Stan Berman. I'm the Vice President for Academic Affairs here at William James College, and I'm delighted that you can spend the next 15 or so minutes with us as I enjoy a conversation with Dr. Bob Dingman. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you very much.
Bob is an associate professor in the Department of Clinical Psychology here at the college. You're the director of both our military veterans program and our Train a Vet to Treat a Vet program.
Yes.
And that's our topic for the afternoon.
Wonderful.
So this program in military veteran psychology was a pioneering program in many ways here in the United States. What was the impetus for the college and for you as the founding director to launch this program?
I have to say, Stan, that the impetus really came from our students. About 10 years ago, perhaps for the first time that I know of, we had a military veteran in the school, a Marine Corps veteran, who had served overseas in our embassies and in particular was involved in a defense of the American embassy in Saudi Arabia. He really put it to our president, Nick Cavino, that perhaps we ought to think about some special programming for veterans. President Cavino thought that was a pretty good idea, and from what I understand, the two of them together started conceptualizing the program that eventually came to be and started a process of trying to build support for that. One of the inspirations for the program is a veteran-led effort initiative here in Massachusetts. It's called SAVE, which stands for Statewide Advocacy for Veterans Empowerment. This is an organization of paraprofessionals, veterans, who go out on an emergency basis and intervene with veterans who are experiencing some real mental health crisis, in particular vets who are considering suicide. It was well known at the time, I would say circa 2007 or 2008, that this group of veterans were saving lives. And politicians and other service providers who were working with veterans said, perhaps we ought to take this to the next level. Let's create a program that we could actually train veterans, not just to be paraprofessionals, but actually licensed mental health professionals and psychologists. So that was the impetus for creating our program.
Terrific, terrific. And now, several years later, what exactly is the program?
It's a wonderful assortment of both student veterans. We have now in our building about 45 to 50 military veterans. I would say about 10 to 15% of those veterans are actual combat veterans. And they form with a like-minded cohort of civilian students, what we call our military community here at William James College. These are people who are intensely interested in working with veterans and helping veterans. They're people that come together to create service-oriented projects here at the school. And of course, we have an assortment of academic courses and field placement requirements, and in our doctoral program we have research requirements as well.
And I introduced you, of course, as leading MVP, Military Veterans Psychology Program. But I also mentioned Train a Vet to Treat a Vet.
Yeah.
Could you speak to that?
Sure. So the Train Vets program is actually what came first. We were very fortunate, I think it was in about 2010 or 2011, to get the support from state government to actually launch this program that we call our Train Vets program. We work in close collaboration with the State Department of Veterans Services here in Massachusetts, Secretary of Veterans Services, Francisco Urena. We receive some nice financial help from them every year, in exchange for which we recruit veterans into roles as mental health providers. We do some research projects for the Department of Veterans Services. It allows us to create a cohort, a small cohort of our veteran students. I call it our special forces. And they go out in the community, they represent us, they represent this whole idea of what I think of as a new career pathway for veterans.
So let's talk a bit about the community of veterans having returned back home. We know that there's an amazing human capacity for resilience. We also know that many people come back with a heavy burden. And what are some of the issues that mental health professionals working with vets are collaborating with them on, are working with them on.
Yeah. There is a tremendous amount to learn about military culture if one has not served in the military. I'm sure this is true for any particular minority subgroup, that there are cultural particularities of that group that make it important for service providers to understand. But veterans in particular seem to be very uniquely concerned about the awareness of people with whom they interact about military culture, and they are quick to be dismissive of the capacity of people to work effectively with them if they feel they don't get it. Our military veterans here, both in the school but also in their field placements, are helping perhaps an older generation of service providers to really understand at least the basics of what those military experiences might be like, so that we can be more culturally competent. The other thing I'd just like to add, Stan, at this point, one of the things I've really learned from our veterans is that they're quite sensitive to stereotypes that get generated in the civilian culture about military veterans. The majority of veterans are not symptomatic, do not qualify for psychological disorders, are not necessarily in need of psychological services. What we know is about a quarter to a third of vets, in particular those who have deployed, stand in need of some kind of assistance, whether that's from professional providers or something I hope we can talk about, more informal networks of support and quasi-professional or non-professional kinds of therapeutic interventions.
So let's go there. Let's talk a bit about these more informal but sounds like powerful networks.
Yeah. So it's not the experiences per se that the veterans have in their military experience that make it difficult for them to reintegrate into our civilian society. It's the receiving environment itself which is problematic. There is really a truly shared existential threat to the entire population that veterans returning from combat service to those environments actually experience far fewer degrees of psychological distress. So this generation of veterans themselves appears to be taking matters into their own hands to some degree and working to create quasi-professional, often nonprofit organizations to help receive our veterans back into our civilian society and to create you could call it a kind of transitional experience for them. So the kinds of experiences that are happening, for instance, there's a wonderful organization right here in Massachusetts. It's called Project New Hope. They do weekend retreats for veterans and their families. There are other organizations that try to recreate I would say the band of brothers, the mission mentality. Organizations like Project Rubicon, which does disaster relief with veterans. There's Wounded Warriors. There are numerous of these organizations that are really looking to kind of recruit veterans to be part of a meaningful set of activities that brings them into close contact with other veterans. Veteran-led nonprofit organizations are really working to recreate that. And I believe it has immense therapeutic value for veterans as they somehow try to adjust to a life that is, frankly, far less meaningful to many of them than what they experienced. Mm-hmm. Many of those vets will say if they could go back into those dangerous situations where their lives were threatened every day, they would do so in a heartbeat because of quality and intensity of those relationships and the meaning that they felt in the activity that they were involved with.
That's really fascinating and very important for us to understand. As well as the existence of and the strength of these less formal networks. Let's shift to talk about the veterans' families. What are some of the issues for the family members?
Families are an enormously important protective factor, an enormously important resource for the reintegration and the readjustment of veterans. And that's news that, as a family therapist myself, I'm very excited about. So that's the good news. The sad news, I would say, or the news that we really need to pay attention to, is that military families, and that would include spouses, children, siblings even, and certainly parents, When a service member deploys, those people are also at some substantial risk for poor mental health outcomes. We also know that when veterans come home and are struggling with depression or post-traumatic stress or even substance use disorders, that family members are at risk as well, and that the recovery of the veteran is clearly and consistently linked to the welfare, in particular of the spouse in those families. There's new research which is going on about the effects of deployment on children. There's a lot to be said about military families and the strengths that they have. And I wouldn't for a second want to disparage the value of military life or the pride that people take in that and the values that it teaches children. People on military bases seem to have some protective features that are associated with being part of that larger military community. And to be quite frank, the Department of Defense and all the branches have worked hard over the last generation to try to provide services for military families.
So once again, you're underscoring that when there's like-minded and shared experiential families together, that it's an important protective variable and factor, and that we shouldn't minimize that the family members out of harm's way, but worried every day, pay quite a price as well.
They do. So there's a saying that I've come to embrace, which is that the military seems to be quite aware of this, that family readiness is key to unit readiness. And we know that even in civilian cultures, where there is increased stress and a need for some kind of resilience, what operates as a powerful protective factor is the capacity for families to do various things well together. That has to do with being flexible in the organization of families, people being able to adapt and adopt new roles in the face of stress. Nowhere is that more true than in military families when a mother or a father might be deployed for up to a year. There's all kinds of reorganization of family roles that goes on. We also know that to the degree that families can have a shared sense of the meaning of an experience, we know that families where there's considerable agreement and buy-in with the mission of the unit, those families tend to do better. And families where there's clear and effective mechanisms of communication, we know that those families do better.
Those indices make a great deal of sense. So I'm wondering about what's next, and I'm wondering about what's next in two ways. As you think about MVP in the next year or two, are there any new initiatives or new directions you're considering?
Yes, in fact, one of those comes directly out of the conference that we recently had. So our conference focused on caregivers of veterans. So these are spouses and typically parents, but sometimes other people, who are in roles that are very stressful in trying to help our most severely disabled veterans, both with physical injuries and also psychological or what we call moral injuries. And we had the good fortune to have our president, Nick Cavino, at our conference, and even he was quite excited about this. So we're going to be looking at ways that as an organization we might either create some targeted coursework around the needs of caregivers to military veterans, or look for places in the community or in the larger region where we might partner with service providers to really create some specific programming for these people that are sometimes referred to as the hidden heroes, the people who support the people who put themselves in harm's way for our country.
As you look at cultural trends in the United States right now, the media has been, in an ongoing way, putting a spotlight on veterans and their needs. It appears there's considerable support in the country for veterans. Do you see in the coming year, 2, 3 years, that there'll be an enhancement of services for vets and their families? Are you concerned that that will not be the case? What's your prophecy?
When we had our conference a week or two ago, there was great discussion about trying to raise awareness and to affect policy so that family members and caregivers of veterans might be eligible for services at some place like the Veterans Administration hospitals. And it was the consensus of our speakers, who all had national reputations, that there seemed to be insufficient will politically right now to really drive those issues towards some kind of meaningful policy changes. I'm an optimist by nature, and what I prefer to focus on is the little piece that we're trying to do. Our mission here at William James College is to try to open a new career pathway for veterans. Historically, veterans have gone into careers like law enforcement or firefighting, security work. We think that anybody in the military, in particular anybody who has been in a leadership role, already knows quite a lot about taking care of the emotional and psychological needs of other service members. We now have our students and graduates serving veterans across the country. We have a recent graduate who's now the ship psychologist on the USS Ronald Reagan, one of our aircraft carriers. We now have civilian students who never wore a uniform a day in their life upon graduation enlisting in, we've had them in the Army and the Navy to become military psychologists. So that's our mission, and around that I feel very, very optimistic. Our program is growing. I mentioned that we had one veteran 10 years ago. We have close to 50 now. Veterans seem to be excited about this career opportunity for them. And we know that in many of the placements where they are often the only service providers who have any military experience. And oftentimes the clientele asks specifically to speak with them.
Mm-hmm. I can't imagine a follow-up question with that ending. And as we're wrapping up, I both want to say thank you.
Mm-hmm.
But any final reflections?
I think that our military veterans have enriched the culture here at William James College immeasurably. They are, by and large, people who are highly motivated. They're eager to have feedback so that they can improve their performance. They're accustomed to that in the military. They challenge us to think differently about military life. They challenge us to examine our stereotypes and our preconceptions about that. I think they bring a diversity of perspective here that William James himself would be proud of. And I think that they raise the game of our other students. These are typically, as students, they are exceedingly responsible and responsive. So I think that's just the follow-up, how much I appreciate and how much I've personally been, I think, positively changed as an educator, having veterans now in pretty much every one of my classes.
Mm-hmm. I'm grateful, Bob. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.